All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. I'm going to talk to my brother, Nicholas Heffelfinger, again today, who is an actor and musician. And we're going to talk about topics like comedy, depression, Sam Harrison, Jordan Peterson, and their whole spiel, and my personal philosophical disagreements with some aspects of what they say, but acknowledgement that I like a lot of what they do. And yeah, we can go anywhere from there. And why don't you just tell everyone a little bit about yourself, Nick?
Well, like Andrew said, I'm an artist and an actor, and I do a lot of. Oh, do you not have my audio? Do you have my audio?
Yeah, I hear you.
Cool. Yeah, I'm an actor primarily. That's what I went to school and trained for, but I also spend a lot of my time writing and performing music and recording music. I play guitar. I'm also learning a little bit how to play piano and bass and ukulele and stuff like that. And I do a lot of scoring music on my computer and stuff like that. And then I do a lot of my work life, working in the technical side in theater and events and film and stuff like that. Yeah, it's kind of my backstory.
And you were
One of
in
the
a few major TV shows recently too, right?
mhm, yeah, I had a 3 episode arc on the most recent season of iZombie, and then I was also an episode of X Files. And then I've been doing some background acting work lately on a number of different TV shows and movies that shoot in town as well. Um, but yeah, the first topic that Andrew mentioned there was comedy, which is something I just has been on my mind a lot lately, kind of in a lot of the media I've been consuming. I just finished reading a book called Sick in the Head by Judd Apatow, which is actually
Oh,
just a
cool.
compilation of his interviews with various different people throughout his life, all the way back to like in the 1980s when he was just a kid, interviewing like stand-up comics and other famous people, essentially like pretending to be a serious journalist and essentially really being the journalist for his school radio station. Um, and then at the same time, I also watched through the entirety of Jerry Seinfeld's show, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee.
Oh yeah, I've seen all of that too.
And then because of watching that and reading that book, and just, spending a lot of time listening to this perspective of stand-up comedians, I found myself watching quite a bit of stand-up in the last little while as well. That's just like a topic that's been on my mind a lot lately.
What
Um,
stand-up have you been watching lately?
I just watched Judd Apatow's stand-up special called The Return today, which is
I've
actually really,
seen
really
that too.
funny.
Yeah,
Watched a
where?
couple of Seinfeld specials that are on Netflix. I mean, in the last year, I've watched like all the Dave Chappelle specials that went on to Netflix,
Those are
and
awesome.
watched a bunch of what is his name? Jim Jeffries.
Oh, I was just gonna mention him.
Trying to think who else. I watched one of Ali Wong's specials. I think Baby Cobra. I did background work on a movie that she's shooting in Vancouver, or was shooting on Vancouver this summer. So that was
Oh,
kind of
cool.
cool.
Did you
Um,
watch any of Eliza Schlesinger's ones?
I haven't watched her new ones yet. I think I've seen like her oldest one, like whatever her first one was that was on Netflix. But it was like 6 years ago now or something like that. I,
Oh, okay.
you know, remembered that it was funny, but it was a stand-up comedy special. One of the things that I thought was interesting about kind of comedians in general, both Jerry Seinfeld talking to them and Judd Apatow talking to them, is it seems, I mean, this isn't like surprising, it's just kind of something that always intrigues me. It seemed that across the board, most of them were either like dealing with depression or it had like a lot of serious, like emotional and traumatic issues at some point in their life. Like for most people, becoming a comedian And I think in a lot of ways that the path is different, but the trajectory is similar to becoming an artist. Is that you kind of have like you develop a sensibility for those type of things kind of out of a like survival necessity. Like a lot of time comedians are people who kind of didn't fit in or were strange or had an uncomfortable home life or whatever else, and somehow making people laugh garnered garnered a positive response. For some people, it's literally like if I made my dad laugh, he wouldn't hit me. For other
Yeah.
people, it was, if I made people laugh, they wouldn't pick on me. Being the class clown is better than being the guy everybody picks on or whatever. Or for other people, it was, if I made my mom laugh, then she wasn't so depressed. Or if I made people laugh, then my family paid attention to me, and there was 10 kids, so I had to stick out somehow, or whatever. Or I figured out pretty early on that I wasn't the smart kid, so if I wanted anybody to pay attention to me, I had to be the funny kid, or it was how I got girls to like me, or whatever else.
For Joe Rogan, it was relieving a little bit of the tension for fighters before they go kick each other in the head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and that's the thing I think is really interesting is like in some ways as an entire thing, like as an existence, like comedy, and also for that matter, like theater and music and poetry, like literature, fiction, not just like writing down history of what happened or lessons on how to do things, um, is a kind of just in a grand sense like a coping mechanism. It's a
Yeah,
a way that either people sort out their own shit by creating these things, um, or like deal with their shit by experiencing others.
yeah, that's an interesting perspective that I think about sometimes too. Like, I often think and talk about how, for me, like all the different forms of creative expression I do, like including podcasts and stuff like this, but particularly writing more than anything else is therapeutic to me, which is one of the things that makes creative expression addictive to me and makes me become like so much of a workaholic that I have to literally consciously be less obsessed with my creative expression.
Yeah, totally. There's this episode of Scrubs. I can't remember like what episode it is, but kind of the larger point of it, I think, is essentially that like part of what we like about sitcoms is that they sort everything out in like 22 minutes, and everything's kind of like upbeat, and even the most terrible of situations always like work out for the best. And like at the end of a terrible day or a hard work week or whatever else, it's nice to get some perspective on like the world by seeing other people having an easy time, and also just kind of like laughing at stuff and releasing some stuff. But in a lot of ways I've also realized that the more I sit on this rock as it rotates around a bunch of explosions in the middle of the universe, um, is that like other shows that I watch, especially I realized I watch a lot of sitcoms and just like funny shows of one form or another. I learn a lot of like kind of life lessons about dealing with situations through humor and like finding the humor in bad situations, but also like how to deal with pretty serious dramatic situations. And they kind of stick with me more because they were funny. Like the way that like Ted and Marshall and Lily and Barney and Robin navigate different specific things, and How I Met Your Mother kind of stick with me because they're poignant and emotional, but also because of the humor that was made about them kind of like solidifies them in me a little bit more. They
Yeah,
have there's a more like nuanced perspective of an idea. If an idea, I think in a lot of ways that's what makes this new kind of trend of like comedy news, like The Daily Show used to be kind of the only show that did that, and then it was The Daily Show and The Colbert Report. Now there's like The Daily Show and The Colbert Report, and then that's like most of what gets talked about on like The Tonight Show and The Late Show and Conan and all that stuff, and you know Jimmy Kimmel and James Corden, and then it's also like Last Week Tonight and you know Daily Show with Trevor Noah now. Like there's so many.
And that Samantha Bee one,
Yeah, I can't remember what that show is called right now.
Full
Um,
Frontal.
yeah, I think
Yeah,
so.
yeah,
But anyways, there's like so many like political comedy and like news comedy shows now, and I think in a lot of ways it's partly like by making light of things. Obviously, it's a little easier to talk more seriously about them because you're like kind of not taking it seriously, so you can like dig a little bit deeper. But I think it is also that like things register with people on more levels that way. You know, it
yeah,
registers with you at like an emotional level and an intellectual level, but also at a level of humor and a
yeah,
level of like, how does this make me like not just how does this make me feel, but is this how like is there a sensation associated with it? Because like
yeah.
something being emotional like that doesn't directly impact you, like watching the news and finding out that a bunch of people have died somewhere else in the world, you know, not in no way could they be related to you, and it's just generally speaking tragic. You don't necessarily like burst into tears thinking about that. But when somebody on like the Tonight Show or whatever makes a joke about how like a politician has dealt with that disaster, or how the people in that country responded to it or whatever else, I find often those statistics about that disaster stick with me better because of the perspective associated with how I learned them.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I like that's one thing I like about stand-up comedy in particular. Like just it's a really like you were talking about, it's a really great way to deal with both controversial issues and depression. And I think also like you were talking about, that's largely because when we make jokes about things, it can make it easier to explore our emotions and intuitions about them, and like be honest about the way we see things too. And that's why like another thing that I like about comedians is that it's kind of like they're funny philosophers. Like no, like there aren't other, well, there are other people who like intellectuals who go up and give lectures, but unlike those, comedians generally, they try to look at things in a way that make people laugh. And if you look at things in a way that make people laugh, I think it also helps you understand different perspectives on different issues more easily too. So that's one great thing about that, I think.
Yeah, in a couple different episodes of Comedians in Cars, Jerry Seinfeld, for obvious reasons, kind of talks a little bit about like stand-up comedy as a concept and kind of a theory, and you know how to set up jokes and stuff like that. And one of the things he talks about is like just generally speaking, comedians are just like curious. They just kind of like when they see something, they're not like, "Huh, that's the way that thing is." They're like, "Why is that the way it is? Why isn't like immediately they jump to is that the most logical way something should work, and probably as quickly as they can try and find a reason it's not, so that they can pick at it and make us all go like, ah, that's true, just by kind of like pointing out something kind of pseudo obvious. But in terms of like the art or the creativity of it, or something Seinfeld talked about in another episode, is like a lot of it is about like how you set up a story. So like if you have a premise that you want to talk about, if you can find a way to bring up that premise that's comical, then you've already got people on your side. And then when you start explaining your premise, then people kind of laugh as they figure out what you mean. And especially it especially works as, and lots of stand-up comedians use this, he certainly didn't invent it, if the original statement you make like kind of makes sense but is also like a little bit absurd or a little bit offensive or a little bit, you know, like cheeky or edgy or whatever. The example he makes to kind of prove it is he like, I had this joke once about utensils, And it started off with, I see the Chinese are hanging in there with the chopsticks. And like, that's already funny, but that's not his joke. His joke is about how, like, they created all these technological advancements and they've been there before so many civilizations for so many things, and isolated community, but then they were exposed to the outside world, and now they have cars, and now they have computers, and now they have whatever, but they're still hanging in there with the chopsticks. And it ends up going down like a whole different train about like other utensils and whatever else, but like his point was essentially that it's funny to just reflect on things that are a little strange or a little absurd, and there's a lot of absurdity in the world. But what makes a good comedian is a person who's practiced and talented at setting those things up properly. It's a little bit like athleticism in that if you set up a shot properly as you pass to somebody, then they can score easily. If you don't set something up properly, it doesn't just go in the net by default just because you're there with a ball, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think the way that you can make people laugh at things that can be offensive, like you were saying, like that's a large part of probably where the skill and creativity come in of being a comedian, because it can be hard to do that. Like, it's all about your tone of voice and stuff like that, and whether people accept what you're saying. That kind of determines like whether your jokes work or not, because otherwise they could just offend people, or they could just be confused about what the hell you're talking about.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. It's
So you wanted to talk about Peterson and Harris and kind of some of the stuff they've been discussing lately too?
Yeah. You reminded me before we started this that you were at the first night of their recent event there. Well, the one that was recently, the videos were published. It happened several months ago, right?
Yeah, it was in late June, I think, or maybe
Okay.
July. Yeah, it was in June. Pretty sure it was in June. I went with my friend Max, and it was really cool. It's really funny too. There was like they messed something up with the like ticketing thing in terms of like how they were scanning people. So it took like a really long time to scan people that got there really early. So like a huge line formed. Like we were literally lined up like the theater where it is, the Orpheum, is at like the south end of a block. And we were lined up all the way down that block and then around the corner and most of the way down that block. Like a block and a
Holy
half
crap.
down a city
Wow.
in downtown, of like probably 4 to 6 people wide lined up, like taking up like half the sidewalk. And it
Wow.
was funny too because like when it's that long, it starts to become like confusing what it's even a line for. Because you're going past other businesses. Every once in a while, somebody would get in the back of the line, and then they kind of be like, "Is the bar really this busy?" And somebody'd be like, "Oh no, no, this is the lineup for the show." And then they'd go in the door of the bar like 6 feet in front of where the line was ending, or go into like a random Mexican restaurant, and it's like, why the hell is there a line all the way down the street for this restaurant? Oh, it's not for this restaurant. Okay, yeah, I understand. So it took a really long time to get everybody in, and then I guess apparently they also had some sound issues, so they weren't like ready to go when they finally got everybody in. They like had to finish getting some stuff going. So, anyways, it took a while to get going, which I think unfortunately contributed to a little bit of conversation near the end of the event kind of getting cut short, just because they were basically like running out of time and they were all getting tired and they had another event to record the next day. I wish Max and I didn't really like realize going in that it was a 2-day event, or we probably would have just planned to go for both days and gotten tickets to both days. Because in retrospect, like we kind of saw the first half of a 2-day conversation,
Yeah,
really.
and you said that you haven't seen the video of the second day, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, when I watched the videos for both of the days, and when you do that, it makes it clear that it is really like two halves of one conversation, because it does cut off kind of abruptly at the end there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, especially like just to kind of like finish off the time that they have, Weinstein gets them to talk about porn and like
Oh yeah.
masturbation and like whether
Yeah.
God cares if you touch yourself, essentially.
Yeah.
Um, and
But
it was like
Weinstein
funny,
was
but you
my
could tell they
favorite.
both wanted to go on to like much longer trains of thought and larger statements about position.
Yeah. Yeah, Weinstein was my favorite aspect of that whole thing. He brought up so many interesting points that questioned the foundations for both of their views and brought up some really interesting questions too. So,
Have you seen
what
the
was
um
sorry, go ahead.
have you seen the Joe Rogan podcast with him and his wife?
Yeah, actually the one with him and Heather Haying, his wife, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I watched that recently. I thought that was awesome.
He and his brother are both just like stupid cool.
Yeah, I agree. The way
What
the
were you gonna say?
Oh, I was gonna ask what your general impression was of
Oh
the
yeah, one of
Harris
the
and
other things I was going to
Peterson
talk about too,
conversation.
being in that line for that long, is it was really interesting getting a perspective on like who the different people that were there were that were going, because like
Oh, okay.
Max and I both know
What?
Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris about equally as well. You know, we've seen like a few books of theirs or a few videos of theirs and like read some of their literature and, you know, looked at different things, seen them talk on other people's podcasts, seen some of their own content, whatever. Um, but most of the people that were in line, at least that we talked to in the time that we were in line, and which was like a decent sample of people. Like, I mean, there was a few hundred people at this event, maybe like 1,000 tickets. I'm not sure exactly how many seats the Orpheum has. It's a pretty big theater. But like we talked to at least probably 20 or 30 people over the course of this, and like almost all of them seemed to only know one of the two of them, really. Like they were like big Sam Harris fans, but they were only kind of like vaguely aware of Jordan Peterson and hadn't really like read any of his stuff or watched any of his videos, or they were like super big Jordan Peterson fans, but they were only kind of like aware of Sam Harris, which was
Oh,
also interesting because it also meant there was a lot of like militant atheists who had like no time to listen to anybody who even entertains the concept of a god. So, you know, they're just like not even there to listen to a lot of what Jordan Peterson had to say.
they just want to see
And
Sam
then,
Harris destroy Jordan Peterson,
yeah,
or vice
destroy.
versa.
Those are my favorite tags on videos on the internet. Is like
I never
Jordan
watched
Peterson
those.
destroys femtard limbot. Like you've already made it clear exactly how you feel about every position made in this art in this video, so much that I don't even need to watch it.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. That's why I never
and
watched
it's annoying because like videos with titles like that are immediately unshareable because if I share it to somebody, they think I agree with the title,
Yeah.
you know? So it's like you've created a video that's insulated to your own community. Good job, you did it.
Yeah.
But anyways, and then the other half of that coin, of course, was you had a lot of people who are like pretty radical thinkers, which I think is a fair moniker to give Jordan Peterson, a radical thinker, but are also like devoutly religious as he is, that were like not ready to have the concept of God questioned hard, you know, and like that's all that Sam Harris is there for, like every day ever. So it was like
Yeah.
really interesting being in the crowd for like the responses to things. My favorite moment of the whole night was at one point Sam Harris makes this point and honestly just like crushes Jordan Peterson. Like any reasonable person watching the moment in this debate would be like, yeah, you pretty much made your point and you're correct in Jordan's, like, if not wrong, at least less correct than you are in the way that you've both made your positions. So like a few of the like hardcore Harris supporters in the audience like clapped. That was honestly like the most annoying part of the night, is lots of times one of them would like make a point, shocking, that's like the whole fucking night, and like 80 people would be like, woo, and then you lose like 30 seconds of time just like waiting for the noise to die down
Because
so they
it's
can
like a
talk again.
concert.
Yeah, well, but it's not a
Like a
concert, right? It's
concert
just
for
people,
intellectuals.
but it's just people talking, so they're not
Yeah.
that loud, you know?
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I bet that would be annoying. What do you remember what that point was?
oh God, it was in their discussion about God, and I think it was something like, I'm pretty sure it was. I might be completely off track, but if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Harris clapping back at Peterson's point about like I live as though God exists. Like he basically like refuses to say whether or not he believes God exists. His
Mm-hmm.
point is like I live as though he does. And it's like, okay, so you believe he exists though? And he's like, well, I don't know, but I live my life as if he does. And it's like, God, you're so aggravating. And like Sam just made some point toward that aim of like how if you're choosing to make those kinds of decisions, then you believe in it insofar as it's worth listening to, which is a form of believing. Like whether you want to label it or not, that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Just, you know, kind of like unpacked some logic on him, essentially. And at the end of it, I mean, to be fair, Max and I were both like, yeah, Sam, yeah. But like, I'm not gonna freaking clap and cheer for the guy. And the funniest part though was like, you know, these 80 bros or whatever. I'm assuming it was mostly
Was
bros. There
that
were
when
definitely
Peterson
lots of
got
women
pissed
there,
off
but
about people clapping?
yeah, like a bunch of people clapped, and then Jordan Peterson goes like, "Why are you clapping?" And it was so like for like 1 second, it was so grumpy old man, like
Yeah.
get off my lawn. And then he, you
That's
know, we went back to Jordan Peterson making some reasonable points occasionally.
That's interesting though that you brought that up. Are you aware of the underlying philosophy of his view that he was talking about in terms of the belief in God?
You mean the whole like I live as if he
Yeah.
exists
Yeah,
thing?
that's a specific realm of philosophy that I might have talked with you about before. Like my friend Hayden Bruce, for example, who I've talked with on here before. I've talked with him, and he's a Christian, and he's what he calls a pragmatic Christian. So he has like the same view as Jordan Peterson on God. He basically acts as if God does exist because of, you know, like Jordan Peterson's whole thing about how there's psychological utility in having religious beliefs and stuff. And now, like, I basically, like, I don't agree with that perspective for the same objections that you brought up, because, like, for me, it's not useful to believe in God. And and also, the way I view it is that I don't have this emotion of what I view as an emotional feeling of faith that people who have faith do have. So it doesn't make sense for me to believe that. But that's a specific realm of philosophy that he was mentioning there without directly mentioning that it actually was a philosophical view of the existence of God that some people have. But you'll never agree with someone or not if they have faith and you don't have faith, right?
Yeah, basically. I remembered actually, I'm pretty sure what actually was the topic they were like debating back and forth on is Jordan Peterson was arguing essentially in defense of that position, in defense of like why living as though he exists is worthwhile, um, by saying that if you have a real problem in your life, I can't remember the exact example he used, but you know, a terrible problem, and you sit at your bed and you kneel and you pray, you really seriously ask, like, I need help, I need an answer, I need to know what to do to make this better. And you really believe it and you truly ask, and you know, you like put in the work and the effort and the whatever, an answer will come to you. Like I promise you, the answer will come. You might, you know, you might have to sleep on it, and you'll wake up in the morning. You might take a lot of thinking, whatever. But like essentially, like prayer were in that like, and essentially like what was frustrating about that like everybody on Sam Harris's side was getting so like you guy was like essentially what he was saying is like whether or not God exists thinking really hard about a problem will probably get you to a solution. If you really, really want a solution, you'll probably figure one out. And so Sam Harris responded to that and was essentially like, all you've argued is that meditation is helpful. Like, for
Which he
me,
argues himself a lot.
there's no value in pretending a thing exists that motivates you to do a thing that's helpful to your reality.
I
You
totally
should
agree.
just do the good thing. Like Max and I
That
talk all the
actually is
time.
related to one thing that we should get to a little bit later, that I disagree with them philosophically about, which I was just arguing actually coincidentally with my friend Hayden Bruce, who I mentioned about this, which is the concept of truth. But yeah, that's a bit of a side note for now. Sorry, I kind of interrupted you there.
What was I going to say?
You were talking about your friend who went to it with you?
Oh yeah, like something Max and I talk about a lot is like one of the frustrating things about organized religion is there is actually a lot of good connected to its organization, like the
Yeah.
realities of like like offering large meals that are available to the community. Often churches are responsible for organizing things like soup kitchens, or like there's a church near the university in Victoria that had like a community dinner every Tuesday night. They just had like their church doors were open and anybody who wanted to could come in and get a free dinner. And there was
Cool.
usually like free bread to take home. And if you brought a Tupperware container and stayed for the whole night, if at the end of the night there was still food left, you could take like leftovers home with you. Like it was, just a thing. And it was all just because like that's what churches do, kind of thing. But there's so
Yeah.
many things about a church that are good things that would be good to exist. But like you can take out the like fake story aspect of it. Like if there was like a community organization based around the concept that it's a good idea on a weekly basis to meet for group meditation and reflection on the week and what's going on in the world and discussion of any serious important issues and time to propose benevolent actions that benefit the community and a time to organize those actions. If there
Yeah.
was like every Sunday morning we get together as a club and like work on some mental health and like talk to each other about stuff and just have some like coffee and chit chat time, and then we like pick what our charitable event for this month is and plan it and do it and figure out who's going to help run this week's soup kitchen event, you
Yeah.
know? And
Well,
all
like,
of that could happen. And there doesn't need to be any like thousands of years ago, a guy got nailed to a
yeah,
tree, or like somebody flew away on a horse or any of that stuff.
yeah.
I'm not
Well,
joking. That's a real part
I
of
know, I know,
Islam.
dude. I
Flies
know.
off on a horse.
I know, but no, okay, so I I have made this exact same argument myself many times, and I still do often because that's why I personally, or one of the reasons at least, that I personally am still an atheist, because you can be a good person and do good things without having to have religion. The the aspect of this where I at least sympathize with Jordan Peterson, though, is that not everyone is going to do good things based on the same perspective. And if people want to have a religious perspective and that makes them better people, then that's a good thing too. So like this, I think you and I have talked about this before too, about how one aspect of my own personal atheism that's changed is that I'm not a militant atheist anymore. I'm an atheist, but if people want to be religious and it makes them good people, then that's fine. If someone is religious or an atheist or anything in between, and they're doing what I pragmatically define as bad, then that's bad, whether they're religious or not.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't care if you believe we're sitting on the back of a giant turtle that's swimming through a space ocean or whatever. Like, you can believe whatever the hell you want. I'm not going to believe shit without you proving it to me. So there's that. But, like, you believing in stuff doesn't affect me in any way. You
Yeah,
thinking that the stuff you believe in allows you to dictate public policy or impact how anyone else lives their life or declare wars or whatever else, that's the stuff I have a problem with. But that doesn't necessarily need to be linked to the whole believing stuff.
yeah.
Like it often
And that's
is, unfortunately. But again, same agreement as what you just said. I care whether or not somebody's doing things that objectively I think are bad. Don't really care what's motivating them to do them, other than insofar as that might aid me in getting them to stop. The thing
right.
that's kind of easy about religion is if we could remove those motivational factors, we could actually stop those actions. Like
What do you mean?
like a war being fought over different factions of a religious order who are fighting each other because of their belief that their higher power has given them the right to it, or that the other faction is like offending their higher power, goes away if you don't believe that thing exists. Like so
Okay.
many of the wars that are happening in the Middle East are about not just like wanting land, but believing that God has given them the right to this land and
Okay.
that retaking it will bring about the end time that they want. Like ultimately, the state of Israel wants to like reclaim Israel as the land for the Jewish people because the prophecy is that if you get all the Jewish people back in the Holy Land at the same time, the end times will occur. You know,
Okay.
the whole like jihadist perspective of like killing yourself for God towards the greater good and getting the whole 70 virgins or 40 virgins or however many
Might be
virgins it is,
72. I'm not sure about the
a
exact
bunch of virgins, is that like it's what you're ascribed to do. You know, there's like
Okay. But
there's a whole lot of not crazy going on. If you really boil down, they're just doing what the book tells them to do. It's crazy if you consider the fact that they're listening to a book, sure, but like it's they're people aren't like making up these ideas out their ass. There's a lot of stuff perpetuated by religion that's just bad that would go away if nobody was believing in the fake made up stories in the book.
okay, well, this is how my views have changed somewhat recently on religion. Like I've talked with a few people about this before, and have defended religion against claims like that in particular. Because, okay, for example, like with all this shit that's going on in the Middle East, it's not as if it's really an oversimplification to think that to say that this struggle in Israel is particularly because of religion, or even only because of religion too, because it's about like there are many different cultural ways to interpret a religion, and they tend to be interpreted in slightly different ways depending on the culture. So a crucial aspect of this whole thing is that the cultural interpretations of these particular religions in the Middle East happen to be really archaic and really fundamentalist. And yes, you can find archaic and fundamentalist interpretations of both Judaism and Islam and every other religion in all parts of the world, but it's more likely to happen there. And this is largely due to that culture. And also, an important point that I like to often bring up about this is that one way that my friend Hunter Motz from Mixed Mental Arts has helped me have a little bit more of a complex view on this is that when he personally was living in the Middle East, this perception of the religious strife there that the media paints is it might be statistically true, but when he interacted with people when he was living there, his impression was that the media greatly exaggerates the religious tension there.
Fair. And I would say that, like, generally speaking, any conflict situation that involves more than like a couple of people is going to start having a lot of nuance into why people are involved in it and what's motivating it and what's fueling it and what's causing it to persist, or whatever else. The bigger argument I was kind of making there is those irrational reasons to dispute with somebody go away. There's certainly not
Okay.
like suddenly no conflict. People are still always going to fight over land for reasons of a place to raise their livestock, or it's just really nice, or it provides us, food or water or shelter, or I just want it and you can't have it, or whatever. It's got oil, it's got
Okay.
diamonds, whatever. People are going to fight for lots of different reasons, but all of those reasons are generally speaking like logical.
Okay. This is an
Just
interesting.
justifiable, perhaps not, depending on your perspective on like whether or not it's worth fighting over a particular thing, or whether or not in any way at all it's worth sacrificing a human life for an object. Some people would argue that war is never justifiable. I'm not really here to get into that per se. More of what I'm getting at is like, and this is a point that I think Sam Harris made during that talk too, is it's you can convince good people to do bad things sometimes. You can convince bad people to do good things sometimes. You can convince I can't remember exactly how he broke it down, but essentially his point was that like religion is one of the only ways that you can convince a lot of good people to do something bad a lot of the time.
Okay, this is an interesting place to get into a more detailed discussion about philosophy, because
Like
I used to buy
Andrew,
this
Andrew,
argument.
Andrew,
What?
you have to let me talk sometimes too.
I didn't realize you weren't finished.
Yeah, no, but I like just started bringing up what he was saying. Um,
Oh, okay.
he like essentially what he's getting at in kind of a grander sense is like it takes a lot of convincing, generally speaking, to get people to do something that objectively on paper is just like bad. Like let's say like reject an entire group of people just like because of one of their traits. Obviously, we get people to do that with or without religion. So it's not really arguable that it's only possible to do that with religion. However, a higher power told me so argument can't really be argued with unless you're arguing whether or not the person who's telling you that is telling the truth, or you're arguing whether or not the higher power exists. Like the thing that's problematic about religion is you can say because God says so about whatever you want, and that's like end of argument if you want it to be. You can say gay people are bad. And then somebody can be like, well, why are they bad? They're not hurting anybody. They're just gay. And then somebody said, well, because God said so. And then you just either buy that or you don't buy that. There's not really any like third option where you buy that, but you just let them chill here anyways, because God probably just meant like say kind of mean things occasionally or something, like there's not like ultimately there is a lot of wiggle room in religion just because people are really good at ignoring the stuff they don't want to hear. But at the end of the day, like the Westboro Baptist Church is only really offensive because they're following things to the letter. They're not like making shit up. They're just listening to every word for word, and not allowing for any subtext or nuance or interpretation. They're just saying every word that's written down in there is exactly what God meant to be said. You know?
Okay. Well, this is this is an interesting place to get into a more philosophical discussion, because it sounds like I used to share this aspect of your perspective on religion that Sam Harris shares, but since then my perspective has changed considerably. Like, Okay, so for one thing, with the Westboro Baptist Church, this is like, to me, this is evidence that there are bad views in religion, but it's also importantly evidence that there are many different ways to interpret religion. And oh, I'm getting an echo here. Oh, it's gone away now. But like part of this is because those particular people in that particular area at this particular time in that particular culture are interpreting religion that way. And it's like it's not like for like their idea that they had about how God hates Iraqis, or God hates soldiers that go to Iraq and Afghanistan or some shit like that. Like that shit isn't really from the Bible. That's mostly their interpretation. And for another thing, I think it's an oversimplification to think that to say that these problems would disappear if we got rid of religion. Because, for example, there have been many places at many times in history where people are just as tribal without religion or with less less fundamentalist interpretations of religion. So I think it's more about tribalism in particular than religion. And like we know from sociobiology, for example, and that for that people are inherently tribal. So we get tribal about our ideologies regardless of whether they're religious ones or not. Like I personally have discovered, and I am certainly not unique in this, that people are extremely ideological about political views too, whether they have to do with religious views or not. And then also in terms of you said that like some of these beliefs are they're like you either have to believe them or you don't. And I think this kind of comes from an idea, this kind of dualistic mindset in Western culture, like it's either true or it's false. And you brought up rationality and objectivity too, which are related to ideas in Western culture, in the sense that there's this dualistic mindset which comes from this idea of the separation between mind and body, which Descartes talked about, who was, if I remember correctly, if not the one of the first people to propose this idea of rationalism, which comes from this idea that the body and the mind are separate, and this idea that we can override our annoying pesky emotions with our righteous rationality. But more recently, through the work of Antonio Damasio, and this is another thing that I've partially learned about from Hunter Mott's and Mixed Mental Arts, and also people like Jonathan Haidt bring this up in their book called The Righteous Mind, is that people, according to more recent research, which has been replicated a lot now, people do not behave rationally. We behave based off of our intuitions, and then we rationalize from our intuitions. So when we think we're being rational, we're actually just rationalizing our intuitions. And in terms of objectivity, I also no longer believe in objective truth because I've been convinced, because I've actually seriously, and well, at least started to seriously investigate these philosophical realms that both Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris seem to hate, which are moral relativism and postmodernism, which and they use this along with other terms seemingly interchangeably, as if postmodernism, moral relativism, nihilism, and Marxism are all kind of interchangeable, yet they're similar, let's say, in some ways. Not all of them, but some of them are similar, but different distinct realms of philosophy. And these guys are supposed to be like super smart intellectuals, but they're seriously not well read on these particular realms of philosophy. And I know that was all a mouthful and a long rant there, so I'm sorry if I went into too much, but you just made me think about a lot.
You just started like 5 different essays, but they were all like it was like 5 intro paragraphs to 5 different kind of related essays. And then you were like, so what do you think about all this? Here's like my library. These are all the books I read this month. What do you think of these? Getting back to your original point about tribalism, we'll see where we get from there. Joe Rogan made this point in, I think, maybe a podcast or one of his stand-up comedy routines or something like this. And as an idea, I really agree with it. I don't know if he got it from somewhere. Essentially, one of the kind of problems of our society is we are exactly very tribal. And essentially, what we've tried to do is be a tribe. But we're just way too freaking big to be a tribe. Like, you can't be in a tribe of 330 million people. You can't be in a tribe of 100,000 people, like these cities that we live in with 30,000 people in them, even like tiny little, just barely a cities. You can't know 30,000 people. You can't be related enough to those people that you're going to make decisions with them in mind. And what that means is, and Shane and I had a really interesting kind of argument discussion about this one time recently, is ultimately capitalism and the world we kind of generally float around in right now motivates people to live with a kind of every man for himself mentality. Like, you got to look out, the way Shane put it is, you got to look out for number one.
Arguably, yeah.
But the problem is there's fucking 7 billion number ones. And if they're all only making decisions based on what most benefits them, they're going to harm a lot of other people in the process. And that's ultimately where, like, probably...
Not necessarily, though.
Well, like,
it depends on what they... sorry, I interrupted you. I can get into my opinions on this one.
If you consistently and perpetually make decisions while only considering whether or not it will benefit you, you will inevitably negatively impact something somewhere.
Nothing's inevitable.
Okay, yes, lots of things are inevitable, Andrew.
No.
If water continues to erode this rock, inevitably it will disappear. That's just true.
Okay, so there was an if there. So it's relative to whether it does continue to erode that rock.
Yes. If A, then B is the definition of inevitable.
No, it's not. Inevitable means it'll happen whether this thing happens or not.
No, it'll happen regardless of, like, intervention.
Yeah, that's what inevitable means.
So regardless of you actually removing the water from a wall that is being eroded, the rock will be eroded.
How do you know?
There's no point in us arguing about your ridiculous nonsense that nothing is real.
Let's not do a repeat of Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson's first podcast.
You're right, Andrew. There is no spoon. Correct.
Yes. Okay, but
anyways, my point was, part of the whole, like, tribal instinct, which I think comes back to, in the context of what we were talking about, essentially, like, xenophobia, is a part of a larger, like, survival instinct that lots of animals have, that we certainly have as human beings. And Shane and I talk about this a lot, is the motivation for a lot of human fear, like, just generally speaking, being uneasy in the dark, has to do with being unsure of the surrounding circumstances. Like, there could be a threat near enough to be threatening, but you wouldn't know because you can't see it. Which is why, like, every kid ever is afraid of the dark. It's not some, like, ridiculous proposal of, like, television or film or, nobody's teaching them this. It happens because it's natural to be uneasy of the unknown.
Yeah,
right?
That's a good way.
And a lot of that comes from not just, like, ooh, there might be threat, but also the specific example that bounces around all the time is, like, if you're a primitive species of human being living, nomad lifestyle out in the wilderness or in the mouth of a cave or whatever else, and say you're lucky enough to be sitting by a fire, keeping warm, having just eaten some food or whatever, and you hear a rustle in the bushes behind you. If you assume the rustle in the bushes behind you is just the wind, and it's just the wind, you're fine. But if it's not just the wind and it's like a tiger or a wolf or something, you get eaten and killed, probably. So you don't survive to contribute to the gene pool, and your genes don't get passed along.
Yeah. This is
If your survival instinct is essentially that every scary noise could be death, so every time you hear a rustle in the bushes, you assume wolf gonna kill me, grab a spear and get ready. The times when it's a rustle in the bushes, the only thing you've lost is like the 4 calories it took you to get afraid and pick up your spear, you know? Not really a big deal. So those kind of things get reinforced over like millennia,
yeah,
which are really hard to break out of people in like a couple generations just by like telling them not to feel that way. So in a
exactly.
lot of ways,
Hashtag evolution.
the basic xenophobia of like, I don't know this person, they're a stranger, or I assume this person is a stranger because they look different or act different or talk different or whatever different. You know, that's where a lot of our xenophobia comes around, like race or sexuality or language or culture or whatever else, is just like they're different. So like, I mean, an example I can think of right now is all the time living in Vancouver, I'm around people speaking different languages. If I'm in a public place and I suddenly realize that people are speaking a different language and I'm the only person not, it's like an automatic response that a little bit of me is like, I wonder if they're talking about me. I wonder if they're like plotting something, and it's, it's not like it doesn't occupy my whole life. I don't have like paranoid schizophrenia or something, but like, that just like tiny little back of your mind awareness is like what kept the ancestors that eventually resulted in me alive long enough to get me here.
That's
You
why
know?
we can't escape judgment and discrimination.
So my kind of larger point around that I'm circling back to within that then is, when that's a reality, I would argue that we don't really need anything to exist in our society and our culture that helps reinforce those xenophobic ideas at a level of like faith. Like
I agree.
for the
I
same
agree.
argument that like it's damaging to have those perspectives around like homosexuality, the until fairly recently, organized religion had a pretty staunch perspective that black people were the sons of Ham, like they're the like castaways of God, and that they weren't going to be saved when Jesus comes back, and like we
Mm-hmm.
could maybe try and save them, but it might be just like a lost cause, they're not really people. And like the thing that I love about science and hate about religion is religion makes all kinds of claims and cares not one wink whether or not it can be backed up by anything. It's backed up by, it's written down in this book, so you got to buy it. The thing I think is great about science is, terrible or not terrible, we can figure out whether or not it's provable to a reasonable level of, lack of doubt. Obviously, it's not in like irrefutable truth, because scientific theories get defeated and reinvented with better versions of them all the time. That's one of the great things about science, is it's constantly being improved upon, but we can figure stuff out. Like there's no thing in science where it's like, this thing is bad. And somebody's like, well, why it is bad? And you're like, because I just said so. If a snake is venomous, it's because through research we've discovered that when it bites you, it will inject you with venom. There's no like, that snake is bad, and then you're like, well, no, it's not venomous, and it's not gonna bite me or cause me any, it's not a constrictor, it's not looking to harm me in any way. Then like the perspective changes to, that snake is harmless, we could keep it as a pet, it's just a garter snake. And then we no longer have the that snake is bad perspective, at least from a scientific reality. Obviously, there's lots of people who are like, that snake is bad, including, hilariously, Shane. Shane's like a
Really?
200-pound guy, and we'll be walking through like random hiking trails, and there'll be like a rustle in the bushes, and Shane will just be like, huh. It's funny because we'll see
um,
like a bear track or like bear poop or something, and Shane will be like, huh, I think that might be from a bear. And then he's just like, there's bear mace in his backpack, but we're just kind of like, la di da di da, but like potentially a tiny thing. He's like, huh.
oh wow. Okay, let me build off the point that you just made, and let me tell you about one of the reasons that I now consider myself to be a moral relativist. For one thing, I actually agree more with the point that Jordan Peterson has made towards Sam Harris before, which is that sometimes sometimes propositions that are false are more useful than the truth. And in the second night of their debate, Sam Harris acknowledged this with his own point that he made in support of this claim, which is that, for example, if you're handling a gun, it's always good to assume that it's loaded, whether it's loaded or not. So
Mm-hmm.
basically, it's more useful to accept this likely falsehood, even if you've checked several times to make sure that it's loaded, than that than the alternative.
Yeah.
And another thing too, you mentioned there too, in terms of science, that I used to agree with Sam Harris's perspective on morality, and a reason that I now no longer do is that like you were saying, science doesn't moralize things. It tells us, like, through experiment, this has been proven, this has been proven, this has been disproven. It doesn't tell us anything about morality. And like we were talking about, some
Well,
moral
within
perspectives
within
are
the
more,
confines in that humans are doing science. I
yeah,
mean, there's certainly been some amoral science. There were German scientists who proved that Africans had smaller
yeah.
skulls and blah, all that
Well,
crap.
Nick,
Go on.
actually, I'm glad that you brought that up too, because a postmodernist perspective, or at least talking with my friend James Sullivan about the idea of race from a postmodernist perspective, helped convince me that, like, I wasn't racist or anything like that before, and, like, no more than anyone else at least, but that the idea, and through learning from him and from postmodernist philosophers, and from hearing Thaddeus Russell, one of my favorite historians, talk about this from a postmodernist perspective, um, I now agree that there is no such thing as race. Like, especially if historically speaking, this idea of race was, Thaddeus Russell talks about how this idea of race was kind of invented by intellectuals in the 19th century. And if there's so these arguments that people make about IQ in terms of race, they might be generally true, but there's so much variation, and people interbreed between different races so much that there's so much variation, that these ideas about race and tendencies in athletic ability and IQ and everything like that between different races become functionally useless. So, and this is like, this idea of race, in the same way as the idea of morals, is that when you're talking about any moral claim, basically any moral claim, it's been seen from a different perspective throughout history, and seeing it from that different perspective has been useful to that. And more importantly, what I often say to people now is that you don't have to moralize about things to be a good person or to not do things. Like, when I've argued with uh, a Christian minister about this recently. Mom's new minister at her new church. He went straight. He's really fun to talk to, by the way, because he's really intellectually curious. But anyway, he went straight to the example of, okay, if you're a moral relativist, why don't you rape babies then? And I said, well, for example, Robert Sapolsky talks about in his book Behave, from a neurobiological perspective, how we all form prefrontal cortexes by approximately the age of 25, regardless of our beliefs or our culture. So we all form moral compasses whether we want to or not. So I just simply don't rape babies, and don't want to rape babies, and don't want anyone else to rape babies, because I simply feel this way. So I don't need to have a consistent moral framework to believe this, and to not rape babies, or, like I was talking with someone earlier, not murder someone. I just have to not do it because I don't want to do it. So this is why, like, people like Thaddeus Russell talk about, for example, a philosophy of self-interest. Now, that can sound selfish, but if you do that, then it can arguably lead to you being a good person still too, even if you're a moral relativist.
Yeah. So on the topic of race, where you brought that up, and then I'll talk about your moral relativist thing a little bit. I watched this interesting Vice video recently about how, statistically speaking, in America, black children are like, I think it was like 3/4 or 2/3 or something, like an egregiously large statistical part of the kids who drown in swimming pools.
Oh,
Like it's
really?
like 66% of the drownings in swimming pools are African Americans or something like that. To the point where you're like, this is like our, and you know, the like immediate racist thought is like, are black people bad at swimming somehow? Like, are they just, and like the reality of it, which is like what this Vice video goes into, is segregation didn't like go away with slavery ending, and the like turn of the 20th century and kind of the first half of the 20th century is when public swimming pools really started becoming a common thing, like building community centers that had pools in them, or building outdoor pools that people could use in the summer or whatever else, like having water sources available inland for all the people who couldn't go to a river or go to the ocean. And commonly they were whites only. And even long after segregation was like technically speaking illegal, it was still pretty heavily enforced, to the point that like until like, you know, like the 70s or the 80s, it wasn't really common for it to be possible for black people to like go to a pool to go swimming. So when your parents don't swim and your grandparents don't swim, there's not really a lot of motivation for people to take you swimming, and you're probably not going to be like, hey, I want to go do this thing that nobody else in the family knows how to do, that I'm going to have to learn completely by myself. And no parent's really going to feel safe taking their child to a pool if they can't swim. Like their child starts drowning and there's nothing they can do because they drown too. You know, that's just like the worst thing ever. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, which has resulted in a lot of that reality. And a lot of the time, those kinds of things in race can be traced that way. Like there's a statistic I've seen quoted before that there's like the PhD candidates at certain universities or whatever were examined against each other, and it was found that the IQs of African American PhD candidates are like across the board lower than the IQs of, you know, white students or Asian candidates or whatever. Like basically just some guy trying to find a way to prove that African American people had lower IQs. But the only real point to make in response to that is that you're relating two factors that have no causal relationship.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like an arbitrary physical trait and a person's intellectual propensity have no corollary value with each other.
Yeah.
It's as relevant as saying people with blue eyes are better at, you know, ping pong or anything like that. You know, they're just like, they're arguments not worth making. And a person like Morgan Freeman, for example, is often referenced as being a person who believes that the only way we're ever going to eliminate racism is if we stop talking about it. And in a sense, I kind of believe that, but not in the sense of like stop talking about racism. I believe that in terms of like stop talking about race. Like we need to stop socially reinforcing the idea that a person's skin color is a relevant stratification.
Exactly. I
Like
totally
I've
agree.
seen a lot of stuff recently about um, representation in media. And first of all, I would just like to put this out here. I certainly agree that all colors, creeds, sexual orientations, and whatever, and every other way that people divide themselves into groups of people should be represented in media, because those kinds of people exist. All movies should have all kinds of people in them because all kinds of people are on the planet. That's
What if
just I
there are
don't think
lots
like
of movies who
every
have?
movie ever needs to have every race and every
Oh, okay.
expression, but like
You're
it
saying,
shouldn't like movies shouldn't just be a party for white people or for men or for gay people or for any singular group. It should be everybody's game.
yeah,
However, a point that gets argued a lot that I have a hard time agreeing with, not from a like end goal perspective, but from a like philosophical start perspective, is the argument that I see a lot of performers of color making, which is that it's about having somebody that looks like them on screen. Like growing up as a kid, there was nobody that looked like me telling these stories. So, you know, like identification and whatever else, and like feeling like my story was being told, all these things, which I understand. However, as a white person, I personally, at least, maybe I'm just a really forward thinking person, or maybe I am lying about my perspective and I'm not being objective enough or whatever. But I personally don't feel that I've ever had a hard time connecting to a story because of a person's race or gender being different than my own. In fact, a lot of my favorite pieces of media growing up were things about women or about people of a different race, or you know, people completely different than myself in one way, shape, or form. um, and of course the argument can be made in the opposite direction, that we're more likely to identify with the character who seems like us. Like Amy identifies really heavily with Hermione Granger. And it's not just because she's really cool and really intellectual, it's also because she had glasses and big bushy brown hair, and like some of the physical traits about her that were really specific were really similar, and she felt kind of some kinship there. But at the same time, like I love Aziz Ansari in Master of None, and it has nothing to do with the color of his skin. One of my favorite movies growing up was Mulan, and I didn't care that she was a girl, and I didn't care that she was Asian. I cared that she was an interesting character going through fascinating struggles and how she navigated and overcame them. You know,
my
however,
favorite
at
my
the same
favorite
time,
novels are the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo novels, and
yeah,
I partially like Lisbeth Salander. But like one of the major things that I like about Lisbeth Salander is that she's a fucking badass hacker, and I would like her the same amount if she were a male character, presumably.
yeah. But at the same time, I understand the argument of like I shouldn't have to only see people that don't look like me
Yeah,
telling stories. Like,
but
obviously, it should be an even playing field for
but
everybody.
but
But, however,
if a white person said what those black people said about white people, they would be called racist.
but only because they're currently in the majority in that specific medium. Like, there's not really any argument to be made for, like, I need more white content. You
Well,
know, there's no shortage,
to me though,
really.
racism is racism regardless of what color of skin we're talking about.
Certainly. And I would argue again that essentially what I was saying before, the only way we're really ever going to like eliminate these issues is if we stop creating them. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know that we can pretend like stop caring about race until we actually get to a point where there is a bit more equality in terms of the representation of things. But at the same time, if the way that you get there is by inflating the quality of the difference, it's hard to just suddenly make that go away.
Yeah. I agree. And also, I'm not saying that some realms in our society shouldn't be more equal. You can make a lot of reasonable arguments that they should in a lot of ways, but I think it also gets really complicated because we have to figure out how, like, when enough equality has been reached, and determine how we determine that in ways that at least the majority of society agrees upon. So that's why it's really extremely difficult.
Yeah, totally. And then I'm trying to remember what the other half of my we talked about I said I was going to bring up something about race, and then what was the other thing I was going to bring up about what you had talked about before?
I talked about moral
Oh yeah, yeah,
relativism.
yeah,
I
totally.
talked.
Moral
Okay.
relativism. So sometimes working at public outreach, I would get into really interesting, for the perspective of people outside me and Andrew in this podcast. Public outreach is a fundraising organization that I worked for, and I was fundraising for Doctors Without Borders for most of that time. So I would often have conversations with people about like different global political issues and like the intrinsic value of humanitarian aid and at all in any context or concept. And honestly, sometimes I would have pretty morally relativistic arguments with people about people who came up to me that were pretty willing to be, in my opinion, amoral. Like, we'll just screw these people. They live in a crappy place and their life's gonna suck and whatever. And you kind of, if you really want to have an argument with somebody where you have any chance of convincing them, you kind of have to like listen to their perspective to the point of kind of like agreeing with it for a bit, and then maybe starting to try and like chip away at it or infuse it with your perspective a little bit, and kind of, veering them in the right direction. You can't just get somebody to make a sudden left turn. It doesn't really
Steel
work.
manning instead of straw manning.
Exactly. But so often I would have these relativistic arguments in terms of just like abandoning morality and being purely rational with somebody in order to justify that, as much as morality is fairly relative, some things are just like objectively never worthwhile.
How
Like,
so?
well, like the example you brought up of raping a baby, for example. Okay, so let's say I'm a person that on paper is okay with the concept of rape. Like, if I'm willing to be morally relative enough that the concept of raping something at some point somewhere is not completely off the table, right? So like, I'm going to be like, for the sake of this argument, I'm gonna be doing some raping.
I can think of a
Is
few
essentially
people
what I'm
who I
saying.
would have been okay with being raped. Like, for example, Hitler, maybe?
Well, okay, but no, but my point is like, I'm saying for the sake of this argument, I'm a person who's okay with performing that act.
Oh,
Like,
okay.
because you're trying to say, for the argument of like, when is a raping a baby morally like acceptable or whatever. And my argument to counter that is, sometimes whether or not something is arguably morally acceptable or not, it's just rationally pointless. So like, getting into whether or not it's moral is stupid. Like,
It's
in
just
this
stupid
context,
it's just stupid and pointless in
yeah, it's
general.
just pointless. So like, in the context of, you're okay with like, you're gonna rape something and you're like, well, why not rape a baby? And you're like, you're right. Arguing the moral relativity of that is hard, because it's just like, well, just like, don't. You just don't though. So from a like purely rational perspective, then my argument to that would be like, well, for one, it's not going to feel good, because like, it's like, there's nowhere to go. Like, you're not going to be capable. Like, it's a baby. There's no orifices. Like, as gross and disgusting as that is, it's the reality. Let's go down the Tarantino rabbit hole. It's going to be terrible. And second of all, if you're there for the purposes of procreation in any way, shape, or form, it's not possible. Like, a baby can't procreate, you know?
Yeah.
So it's pointless in both perspectives. Like, if you're at the point where raping is your thing, I guess. Well, I don't know what that world's like, but like, there are better choices, is
Yeah.
essentially my argument to that insane person. And in the context of like fundraising, sometimes I would argue to people like, well, like, okay, so you want to get morally relative with me about like whether at a fundamental level caring for people who are ill or injured when we have the capacity should be done. Like, essentially the moral relativity of like, does having the ability to help a person obligate you to help them if they're physically proximal to you? Like, if somebody's bleeding and I have bandages, does it make me a bad person not to offer my aid if they haven't asked?
See, to
I
me,
would argue,
if you're not moralizing about it, it makes it seem to me like you're more genuine about actually caring about those people.
Yeah, which is essentially morality. Like caring about other people is that's what morality is like the rules
That's
of
like
caring about
the
other people.
inevitable moral compasses that we form in our prefrontal cortexes that I mentioned.
Yeah. So essentially, what I'm getting at is like, let's say you're a person who's just morally bankrupt, and you would actually like essentially see a person bleeding in front of you and have bandages in your pocket and still be like, well, he hasn't asked me for help, so these are my bandages, and walk on by in your merry little life. um, I could still make an argument to that person on why Doctors Without Borders, like charitable intervention, is useful in that diseases don't have any borders. Like Ebola doesn't care where you live. So if we don't intervene into impoverished areas that don't have access to adequate medical care and stop a malicious, fatal disease from spreading, then eventually that disease starts spreading to you or your country or people you give a shit about, or just near enough to you to hurt somebody in your family or your friends. So like whether the morality of the decision is there for you or not, like whether you could give two fucks about helping other people, the rationality of like keeping yourself safe is there. It's the same argument of like whether or not you care whether people have access to education from a place of like, I'm a good person and I want people to learn how to read and write and all that stuff. It's rationally like objectively useful to not be surrounded by morons. We're kind of already surrounded by morons. Imagine if they didn't have to go to school. Like imagine if you went to a store and none of the cashiers knew how to do math.
Okay.
Like imagine going around day to day and most people couldn't read. Like just a basic education system is reasonably objectively worth having, whether you morally believe that teaching people stuff is good or not. Like morality aside, it's just a rational, helpful thing. I would argue, although God, can you not get people in the United States to believe it, that the same can be said for healthcare, in that like it's beneficial to not have a bunch of like semi mobile people walking around on like crutches or in wheelchairs or with mobility aids because they were able to access the care that got them back to moving around regularly. First of all, they're not like leeching the system, if you want to refer to it that way, by needing continual help. But second of all, they're just like not occupying more space in sidewalks and more space on public transit and like, slowing down the physical movement of people through spaces by using those things. And for themselves, they're more available to do things and more available to do a more physical job or whatever else. But also, same thing with disease. Like, if more people have more access to more healthcare, there's less sickness going around that could potentially get you and your selfish, morally bankrupt ass sick.
And
You
it
know?
often, and it sometimes, at least I heard recently something about how, at least with the United States in comparison to some other countries that have socialized healthcare, it ends up costing the government more, or it ends up costing the country more, not the government, to not offer universal healthcare. And I agree with all of the main points you just made. We agree about the sentiments of those points, but you kept using the word you kept using the word rational and like rationally objective. And so like what how do you define the words rational and objective in that context, especially given what I said earlier about how, a lot of recent research has shown that people are not rational, and we operate off our intuitions and rationalize from those.
For me, like when I say rationally speaking, I mean like looking purely logically at a situation of circumstances, removing the emotion for others from it. So like you're essentially just being like selfish or self-sufficient and looking at a situation based on like, will this situation impact me positively, negatively, or neutrally? And if it's positively, how do I assure that occurs or do what's in my power to help that? If it's negatively, how can I counteract that? And if it's neutrally, carry on with my life.
Okay. So you're
And
using like a pragmatic definition there, basically, which I use all
and
the time.
and objectively, I'm trying to use in the kind of like classical sense of like looking at a situation for its context from the outside without necessarily carrying um, emotional perspective or bias or like a position around that issue. Like it
But we're
is,
always biased, though.
I mean, to the level that people cannot be. Yeah, whatever. My point is like objectively, diseases spread from sick people to other sick people, and you either like the sick people get the diseases and die, so it can't pass on because there's no living host to pass to, or it continues spreading, or you treat the people so they can't pass it. Like those are objectively the three options for how a disease runs its course in a population, right? So
Well, see, the like the word objective there bothers me too because they're like human beings are really terrible at finding causes for things. In fact, like one of the I was talking about this earlier
I mean, I
today. One
think
of
we're
the
better
reasons
than like pretty much every other animal at it. So
no,
terrible
because
might be
they're
a little
like one of
harsh.
the reasons one of the reasons I joined mixed mental arts in the first place too was Hunter Mott showing me this graph that shows that other primates their cause finding their the ability to find causes for things is higher, much higher in some cases than humans. Our true superpower is our social intelligence, so building off of each other's ideas. And you mentioned the word logic there too. That reminded me of how even Sam Harris himself, who is like a rational objectivist, I would say, or an objective rationalist, however you want to define it, he himself has said before that like if you have faith in a god, for example, say you're like an Islamic terrorist, if you have faith that you will die, that when you die you will go to heaven and you will get 72 virgins, then it is logical to kill a bunch of people. So another one of the reasons how why I don't believe in objectivity or rationality anymore is that you can look at anything logically if you want to, depending on your beliefs, which are informed by your culture, your upbringing, your genetic predispositions, which are affected by all these other factors, and so on and so forth.
I would disagree with you, and I guess by that extension, Sam Harris, if that truly was the point that he's making, that
He wasn't making my
if you
final
have
point. Yeah.
faith, then making decisions based on your faith is logical for you. Because I would argue that that's a misinterpretation of what logical means. Um, Logic is supposed to be like um, like deductive reasoning, so like deducing causality. um so having faith that when you die you will go to heaven if you follow the will of a higher power, um and then that tells you to kill 7 people, is not a logical decision. I would argue that's an ideological decision. A logical decision would be to say, when I kill a person, other people around me, like when other people around me have been killed, their surrounding social network has been distraught, dismayed, damaged. It's caused problems in families. It's whatever else. So my deductive reasoning is that killing people is bad because when people have died, it has impacted people pretty much exclusively negatively. Like a person's death rarely positively impacts their direct social circle.
Isn't that I think that's an ideological position too. I was actually
No.
making this.
That's
No,
deducing
no, that's
that
this logical.
someone's death, like observing that someone's death causes grief, and therefore deducing that causing death would result in other grief. That part of it is all logical. The only part of it that's like moral or empathetic is therefore choosing not to do it. Certainly,
Okay, but
I'll
this
agree with.
is this reminds me of I was talking to my militant atheist friend about this recently, and I was talking about how and Mum was off screen and brought up this example actually when I was talking about it, about how some like even a loved one's death can cause good results. Like the way Mum was talking about this is that when our grandpa died of cancer, she sure as fuck wouldn't go back in time and wish for it to happen again, but it did lead to some good results in a way, because it led to her being a better preacher and a more compassionate and understanding person, especially when people go through loss. So it's not saying that it's logical for death to be bad and for people to grieve about a loss. It makes sense and it sounds good, but it's not necessarily logical, because like one of the main reasons why I don't necessarily believe in like objective logic, let's say, is that it all goes through the lens of any one person's particular interpretation. And like I was saying, something that's logical to someone else could be completely illogical to someone else. And it's not necessarily the case that either of these persons' views are like objectively scientifically provable.
So I think the thing which you seem to get hung up on, like every time anything ever gets talked about in any context, is that like nothing is like completely anything. Like ultimately, nothing in the universe is actually touching anything else in the universe. Like it at a cellular level, the synapses are this far apart from each other. Like, there's most of the galaxy is empty space and all those other like weird science paradoxes. It's like no true thing is completely true. It's as close to true as we've gotten so far,
So
and
there's
that's
no
where we're at.
objective
You know?
truth.
But like there's not really any objective per se when you really boil down to the brass tacks of it. But what I would argue is that there's no anything because we just made it all up. Like language isn't
Exactly.
like language is real insofar as we created it, so now it exists. But like language is existent only because the humans who made it have continued preserving it. It goes away if we do. Like rocks are real insofar as whether or not we're here or not, there are still rocks, as far as we're
Well, see,
aware, at
see, we don't
least.
know that.
Assuming the whole thing isn't a simulation, the rocks are like the
Like
rocks are not metaphysical. They are
we
a
wouldn't
physical existing reality, at least within the confines of the reality we're walking around in.
like
But
if we
the
didn't
point that
exist,
I'm
we wouldn't
making,
be
Andrew,
around to make that determination.
yeah, the point that I'm making though, Andrew, is when somebody says they're being objective or objectively logical, essentially what they're saying is they're trying to acknowledge to you that they're making an attempt, feeble though it may be, as you might think, um, to remove from themselves the bias or emotional um, deviation that comes from examining a situation.
Okay.
Obviously, there's no such thing as completely unbiased all the time. Although I would argue against your belief that there's no such thing as unbiased and say that people make unbiased decisions about things that just don't really impact them all the time. It's hard to
Like
be
what?
unbiased when you have a strong bias towards that thing.
You
Like
might
I
be
don't have
right
any
that
biases
I'm overly sensitive about this though. That
I don't have any
maybe
biases towards like white middle class men generally because like I am one. So like if
Don't
somebody
you have
asks me to
biases
make
against them in some ways?
maybe a little, but like generally speaking, if somebody asks me to make a decision about a group of people, not okay, like middle class white men isn't maybe a good one. Like Canadians, like a broad demographic, to the point that like there's people I like, there's people I don't like, there's people I agree with, there's people I don't agree with, whatever else. Like if
I'm
somebody
just
asks
gonna
me,
turn off my camera while I get more coffee. Sorry to interrupt you.
or like even to remove myself from the equation, Americans, like uh, would it be better for Americans to have blah 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 or blah blah blah? Like generally speaking, with a very narrow margin of perhaps untruth, I would argue that I can make a fairly unbiased decision about something affecting Americans insofar as it's not going to directly impact me.
Mm,
Like,
yeah, you
obviously,
like.
not completely, not all the time, but if somebody was like, what flavor do you think people are more likely going to flavor's not a good one because it's hard to remove your own bias about how things taste from a thing, but like um what do you think is going to be the most popular color of sports car in Florida? Like the likelihood that any of my own biases about like
Yeah.
car color are going to come into play is like basically nil. I suppose one could argue that if I have any knowledge of like popular car color, that could perhaps influence my answer. But in terms of like a bias, in terms of a like predisposition to choose one answer, there's very little, to the point of like arguably negligible, because there's lots of like decisions where just like we have so little objectivity or perspective already that we're not going to be able to really make like an informed decision.
Wouldn't you say that we at least have mild preferences about at least almost everything?
Well, like something that I have no perspective on, like if somebody said like how long does it take an Olympic figure skater to wear out a pair of skates? I have no capacity to answer that question with a bias because I have no information to supply answers to that question. Like, I know nothing about how long it takes a skate to wear out in any context, nor do I really have an understanding of how much more wear or specific wear an Olympic figure skater may specifically put on their skates. Like, I don't have any perspective on that issue. So it's basically
What?
impossible for me to be biased just because there's no existing parameter of bias.
Okay.
Does that make
Um,
sense?
yeah.
And like
I just
you're certainly probably more right in some cases in that like most things most of the time relate to us in some form, way, shape, or form enough that we can be a little like if not if maybe biased is too strong of the word, at least like informed,
yeah, let me know
you
when you're.
know?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly some decisions that we know nothing about, so it doesn't make sense for us to really have an opinion about it. But I mean, a lot of people would have an opinion about that figure skater example anyway. And
Well, but
like,
like lots of people might answer that question, but I don't think that you could argue that their answer to it is biased based on anything from their life unless they've actually lived a life that involved knowing anything about like skates wearing down or like if they've worked at a sport check in a skate shop, or even like maybe you could potentially argue that like Shane might answer that question with a little bit of bias because he worked in footwear, so he knows like about how long it takes shoes to wear out, so that would inform him. Like I honestly wouldn't know if the answer would be weeks, months, years.
I
I'm
don't even.
guessing months. My guess would be months. But like, I don't fucking know.
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of moral decisions, What I'm
Certainly.
arguing is that we're always biased.
In terms of like morality, it's essentially like you can't not care about something in the situation.
Yeah,
Essentially, like either you it impacts you, so you care about yourself, or it impacts somebody you care about, so you care, so there's a bias there, or how you would make the decision if it impacted you or somebody you care about impacts how you make the decision, or you just elect to care about one of the two parties in the decision and then make the decision with that bias. Like we don't actually have any relationship in reality to characters in books or movies or TV shows, but we often make biased decisions about how we want the plots and those things to turn out based on which characters we agree with or like.
for sure. And so like that's why like I said, I've talked with people who have, like, you'd probably be surprised by how much some of the people I've talked to seem to hate both Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, or one or the other. So I often defend both of them because I don't hate the fucking guys. I think they have good intentions, and I still agree with a lot of what they say. But for example, in terms of what you were just talking about, one of the things that I don't like about their perspectives is that they both basically argue, or I guess at least Sam Harris more than Jordan Peterson, not necessarily Jordan Peterson, but for objective morality, and in Sam Harris's case, that we can arrive at from science. And I think this is, like, not the case at all.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think about both of them that causes a lot of people to find them like inflammatory or objectionable is they're very um devout's the wrong word, but like
Sam
driven and
Harris
like
is devout
dedicated
about
to
it.
their positions. They're like strong-willed, like they're not easily swayed. The positions they've arrived at are based on a lot of thinking and a lot of discussion and a lot of nuance and like a lot of reading and a lot of listening to other people talk and a lot of talking to other people and a lot of like unpacking a lot of this stuff. And the thing I think is really interesting about both of them and about like just kind of the larger intellectual community that seems to be the quote unquote intellectual dark web, as they were talking about in that thing a little bit, is like they creating a space for those kind of conversations is starting to get a lot of these people on more similar playing fields. And they're getting on more similar playing fields not by like one guy convincing the other guy that he's been right the whole time, but largely by both of them kind of conceding a little bit and accepting a little bit from the other and arriving at some kind of common ground somewhere in the middle. Um, which is ultimately like those kind of long, nuanced, elaborate conversations over time, I think are the kinds of things that would result in more effective policy for like government and social hierarchy and stuff like that. The problem is those kinds of conversations take way too long for the amount of stuff we have to try and get done in a political process when, coming back to my point from much earlier, you're trying to do it for 330 million people. It would work way better if we had small groups of like, I don't know, like 500 people or something like that, that were all like self-managing their tiny little chunk, and then those chunks all like related to each other, 500 chunks related to each other, and then 500 of those 500 chunks related to each other, like a sectionalized system, which we kind of have. Like, we have a federal government, we have a provincial government, we have a municipal government. The problem is the municipal government's still trying to look after way too many people, often like tenfold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold too many people. And they don't have all the power. They have some of the power, and then the provincial government has more, and then the federal government has more, and then kind of the UN has more, but then also there's all these international agreements, and it all just gets convoluted because everybody's kind of trying to have that conversation. They're trying to make the argument for their perspective on the positions, while everybody else is making the argument for that. And then, of course, where it gets more complicated is each politician is representing 33% at most of the people who agree with them, and another 70% who don't agree with them, but to differing levels. And that's how they got their position, is by getting the least amount of disagreement.
Yeah, I agree. You're basically a pragmatist, Nick. You should do some reading of the philosophical pragmatists. Some of them, like some of the original ones, like William James, get a little too religious for me sometimes. But there are some non-religious ones who my friend who I mentioned, Hayden Bruce, has recommended to me that I could recommend to you. I don't think I remember any of them off the top of my head. Maybe maybe Jose Medina is one. He's done some interesting work, if I remember correctly, from like more of a secular perspective. But yeah, I mean, again, I agree with the sentiment of most of what you said there, and also, this is interesting too. You mentioned the intellectual dark web, and I was actually having a conversation again with mixed mental artists the other day. They were talking about the intellectual dark web, and that like some of them have more of a problem with them than I do. And I mean, I personally like the intellectual dark web and what they're trying to do, but I also agree with criticisms of them that they seem to be like in kind of an echo chamber with each other a little bit, and they're not they're not examining some of these issues at the depth that a lot of them seem to be, like, in my opinion, deserve to be examined in. Like, for example, I kind of alluded to this earlier. You mentioned that they're intellectually curious with each other, and that's one of my favorite. That's why, like Joe Rogan, who I often forget is part of this, is by far my favorite member because he's the most humble, and that's why when I was talking with Hunter Motz about this on Mixed Mental Arts the other day, he was talking about how Joe Rogan is more of a scientist than the other scientists and actual intellectual thinkers in there because he's so humble and he's aware of how dumb he is. And that's why I
Well,
love
Joe Rogan
Joe
is like
Rogan.
actively a scientist. Like he's like
Yeah,
a researcher. He's,
yeah,
he's going out and asking lots of questions and listening to lots of answers and trying to like figure stuff out by asking lots of smart people who are doing some looking for answers, what answers they're finding.
mm-hmm,
A lot of the scientists he talks to are people who haven't done research or participated in like a study or a thing in a long time. They're just kind of going around like collecting stuff to defend what they already found,
yeah,
or like shoring
exactly,
up their belief system or supporting their fan base or whatever you want
yeah,
to call it. One
exactly.
thing I would agree with you about on that I've kind of noticed before and just not managed to point out to you before is something I think is really interesting about that whole group of people is it's very, not exclusively obviously, but very predominantly white, upper middle class, like post-secondary educated, usually with more than one degree, and like over 40.
They're intellectuals.
So like they have interesting perspectives and they got a lot of good ideas and whatever else, but there's no one from any other ethnic or cultural background. There's nobody from any other like socioeconomic background. There's not a lot of youth going on in there. There's just like, in a way you're kind of right. It's kind of a like old intellectual white dude echo chamber,
Yeah,
which isn't
and
necessarily like dysfunctional, but it's less functional in terms of like conspiring for larger social or like cultural
yeah,
change than I think it could be.
and you're
Like
talking.
until Matt Dillahunty starts getting a larger basis of like not just white people participating in his show until, you know, more than just Joe Rogan are interviewing like women and people of color on their podcast to talk about like interesting philosophical and intellectual concepts. And I mean, I don't spend a lot of time consuming podcasts, so I'm not necessarily the best like researcher or whatever you want to call it for that. But yeah, that's just something I've noticed a lot is like there doesn't like kind of the only person of color I can think of that gets referenced with any kind of real respect regularly in that kind of like intellectual dark web community is Neil deGrasse Tyson. And he's not really intellectual dark web. He's like intellectual light of day. He runs the fucking Hayden Planetarium,
Yeah.
you know, or like Michio Kaku. But again, same thing. He's like actively just doing a bunch of science. Lawrence Krauss kind of like navigates the rift between the two of them a little bit, I guess, because he definitely like goes on lecture tours and does a lot of that stuff, but he's also like an actively involved science in a lot of ways too. But he's also, you know, an old white guy. He's not a person of color.
You're talking about sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just was something I thought about one time recently when we had like a big discussion and argument about like some different political positions, and I was like, it was probably close to a year ago now, and I was discussing some positions I had based on some, you know, thinkers I'd seen talking online and stuff like that, and you were discussing some positions you had based on some podcasts you've been listening to and whatever else, and I was thinking about like what the differences were in where we got into our perspectives from in terms of like the sources of those ideas. And one thing I was noticing kind of from both of us, but maybe more from you than from me, as it seemed to largely be from other white men. And I found that I'm like subconsciously kind of guilty of that a lot of the time too. Like a lot of the, and some of it is certainly the media. Like it's still generally speaking a lot easier to find stuff where white people are doing it than anybody else doing stuff in terms of like film and TV. There's a lot more content that's not that, but it's still generally speaking easiest to find white people doing shit. In terms of like comedians dealing with political and current event issues, it's like all white men. There's
What about
Samantha
Dave
Bee,
Chappelle,
a bunch of white dudes, and
Chris Rock?
Trevor Noah. Not stand up. I'm talking like late night, like
Oh, okay.
comedy hosts, which is where I get like a lot of my like daily news update, just kind of like what's going on in the world, is often like Stephen Colbert joking about what's happened in the world today on the Tonight Show, or
You should
Jimmy
listen to some
Fallon
more.
joking about stuff, or I watched Last Week Tonight with John Oliver a lot, and he digs into a lot of political issues, or you know whatever. Jimmy Kimmel will talk about an issue, or just you know like news anchors on shows or people in podcasts or whatever else. Still largely the majority of the content I'm readily able to access is kind of white guys.
Yeah.
It's
You're
changing gradually, but still for the most part, if I want to listen to somebody that doesn't look like me discussing an issue, I need to go looking for that stuff. And some of that's my own responsibility. I just also spend like no time thinking about that stuff.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about diversity, and yeah, like, well, like for one thing, like we mentioned earlier, the like someone's race doesn't matter to me. But like on the other hand, in terms of what you were talking about, I literally try to seek out people who don't look like me, who have different opinions too. And in terms of diversity, I think that diversity of ideas is often not talked about, and equally, if not more important than what someone looks like too. So, like for example, instead, and I'm not trying to make any assumptions about everything that you watch here, but like instead of just all of those talk show hosts you mentioned are liberal, I like to now get like liberal views, libertarian views, conservative views, and everything in between. And like how I talked about how I like to get atheist views and religious views. And I think it's really like, to me, it's really important to get a really wide diversity of ideas to because it's the best way for me to help correct my own biases the most. And also in terms of in terms of the intellectual dark web, like that's one of the problems that I agree with people who criticize them, which is that they don't have that much of a diversity of ideas. Like, for example, we were talking earlier about how they basically all seem to believe in objective truth and objective morality, and they all seem to demonize postmodernism and moral relativism too. And what I alluded to earlier is that, for example, Jordan Peterson mixes up these realms of philosophy as if they're interchangeable. Like he says, postmodern neo-Marxist, for example, which is clear evidence that this well-read guy has actually not read the original postmodernists like Foucault and Derrida, who I've gotten into recently. And since I've gotten to the place where I can understand some of what they say, with the help of people I mentioned like Thaddeus Russell and my friend James Sullivan, I understand that the term postmodern neo-Marxist is basically an oxymoron. Like Marxists offers some of the best criticisms of postmodernists, and postmodernists are about breaking down systems of power and breaking down concepts. They're not about generally speaking anyway, replacing them with this one moral and societal framework like Marxists are. And Jordan Peterson also used the term postmodern nihilist, and he just always makes this what I would say as my friend Dusty the other day, he brought up this term. It's like the gateway drug theory, that moral relativism leads you to be a nihilist, as if you don't have this particular moral structure, you'll just want to hate everything and break everything down. And also, moral relativism is often a part of postmodernism, but they're not moral relativism and postmodernism are not necessarily the same thing. Like, I might have mentioned this earlier, but for example, I consider myself to be a moral relativist, but not necessarily a postmodernist, because it's a very complex and wide-ranging philosophy. I have not investigated it that much yet, and there are bound to be some postmodernist perspectives that I disagree with.
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of the common, I would argue almost most common errors that a lot of people make about public figures is the assumption that because they're intellectual or because they're incredibly smart or incredibly knowledgeable about a particular area, that they're therefore intrinsically knowledgeable and smart, like across
Exactly.
the board. Like a lot of people assume that because Neil deGrasse Tyson is as smart as he is and, you know, runs the Hayden Planetarium and whatever, that he just like knows all the things and is super smart and gets everything. But there's like lots of videos where he talks about scientific concepts and kind of like talks out of his ass a little bit because he only kind of vaguely knows what he's talking about. Or there's also just like large fields of information and study that he wouldn't dare bother to even brush the surface on because he just knows he doesn't know anything about them. But somehow you get to a certain level of like intellectualism and people just assume you're fundamentally correct all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then you get to somebody like Jordan Peterson and they can say like postmodern neo-Marxist, and like he's saying it with such conviction, it must be a real thing. I don't know
Yeah.
who these people are, but they sound terrible, you
Yeah.
know? And then
And
afterwards you're like, oh, he's talking out his ass. Okay,
And
that's
like I think
cool.
you and I might have talked about briefly before. I wonder what you think about this. To me, since I have seemingly like I'm not saying I'm sure as fuck not saying I'm a genius and I'm smarter than Jordan Peterson. I mean, I'm sure he's smarter than me in a lot of ways, but like to me, I agree with a lot of his objections to the political things that are happening, especially here in Canada. But to me, the people who are trying to force their views on other people, they're like radical authoritarian progressives. They're not postmodernists. There might be Marxists, but they're not postmodernists to me at all.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue that trying to force people to think the way you think is a postmodern perspective. That's been going around for a long fucking time.
Yeah, exactly. It's an authoritarian perspective.
You know what I think a part of it is, and like I hate to say this because I agree with you in that I think Jordan Peterson makes good points a lot of the time. I think Jordan Peterson's like a little bit immature in the way that he makes points sometimes, and that I think like he's a little bit tactical in like he uses a term like postmodernist neo-Marxist, and like you don't even really know what like nobody fucking knows what that means.
I
It's
didn't.
referencing this like it's referencing this like alien group of people that you can't really define. So it
Yeah.
becomes like this like xenophobic.
Uh-oh.
You can agree with him is bad because he's like so sure about it and he's using really smart words.
Exactly.
So then you're
And
like, yeah, totally, dude. You're absolutely fuck yeah, he's right.
yeah,
Holy shit, like he's right. And then
bro,
suddenly you're
you're
like,
such a genius, bro.
and
Bro,
then yeah,
totally.
suddenly you're like ascribing to everything he says and signing off on his entire perspective and things because you're just like, well, like he must be right. He's so smart. Look at him.
Yeah,
He's using all these words I don't even understand. And it turns out he's just blowing smoke out his ass and doesn't
yeah,
know what he's talking about. But like,
exactly.
but only in the context of like that definition, maybe, or
And
that
then
sentence or that point or whatever.
exactly.
You know, like
And
the other thing I think is problematic about the intellectual dark web as a whole is there seems to be a little bit too broad of a like I exist therefore my opinion matters. Like anybody can share their opinion on anything, but I don't know that Jordan Peterson really has that relevant an opinion on like evolutionary biology, for example. It's not really his field of expertise. So listening to him talk about it, while maybe a good way to pass a Tuesday afternoon, is probably not going to really like teach me a lot. You know,
and even
listening to Joe Rogan ask Brett Weinstein questions about evolutionary biology and have him and his wife like unpack that stuff, but also be like, we're impacting in as far as we can go with the information we have is a lot more interesting to me because they're actually credentialed enough to not just be blowing smoke. They're backing their stuff up with information.
yeah,
And I
totally.
would
And
argue in some cases that like smart or intelligent is just like a relative and objective measurement. Like
yeah,
IQ is almost like a pointless system to me in some cases because I've met lots of people who seem dumb that are really smart at some things. You know, like there's this guy that I've seen around a few different event setup gigs in Vancouver, and he's a rigger. Like he does like the rigging to hang like trusses and different stuff up in the overhead galleries so that you can hang lights and whatever, or like hanging. There's just lots of stuff gets hung up in the air in the context of like live performance. And
yeah,
you like listen to the guy talk and you look at him like just like kind of how he dresses and how he walks around and whatever else. And like he just seems objectively dumb. Like he just like you wouldn't be surprised if he showed up in an episode of the Trailer Park Boys. You know, he's just like that kind of person. You can just like you like, hey, how's it going? And his response is like, oh, it's going pretty good. It's really well. Like you're not sure if he's like about to throw up or just like constantly drunk or like what's going. But it's just like your initial perspective on him for like almost anybody I've ever met that I talked to about the guy is like that guy seems like he's dumb. But I've also never met anyone, nor have I met anyone who has met anyone who is more knowledgeable and arguably intelligent within the confines of his industry, rigging. That guy knows everything about like every knot, every different kind of way you can attach stuff to stuff, the different ways you can use things for things, and like MacGyver things together and use things the wrong way to accomplish the right task. And just like he's so knowledgeable and like to the point where it's like you can't be that knowledgeable if you're actually dumb. Like if your IQ was just really
exactly.
low, you wouldn't have the capacity to absorb and use this much knowledge. You know,
Yeah.
like I've met people who actually are like not very smart. Like they just definitely have a low IQ and like they have a hard time maintaining a large amount of knowledge at the same time. You know, like operating under several different confines or parameters or whatever. Like this guy is not one of those guys. His field of knowledge is just kind of narrow and specific. So if you start trying to talk to him about like current events or something, he sounds like a drunk 5-year old, but it's just because you're not
He's
in his
not articulate.
wheelhouse, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Something I
totally.
talked to Amy about recently that I think is really relevant and crucial is like the whole world is pretty much just running on reps.
That's a good
Like pretty
analogy.
much anyone anywhere that you meet who can do anything has done it a bunch of times. So either
If
they're
they're good at what they do, right?
because they've done it more or they've done other things in their life that have contributed to them being good at that thing, and that's it. Like I honestly borderline don't believe in the concept of talent anymore, in that I think talent is really just a great way of saying you liked something enough that you spent a long time doing it and you're willing to get good at it even though you weren't initially.
That's almost a conservative sounding value, bro. Beware. That's one that I share, though.
Well, but
I
like I
like
don't
a
even
lot.
know that that's a value. Like I just like the concept of talent as an idea to me seems to cheapen the effort of the person who contains it. Like saying,
I
look
see
how
what you.
talented
Yeah,
that person is, to me seems like look how lucky that person is to be so good at that
yeah,
by default or whatever. Like not look how hard that person worked to get that good at that thing.
yeah.
Like I wish
Totally.
instead of talented we said skilled or practiced
Yeah. This
or
is this and everything you just
studied.
said just made me think about a lot of things. Let me build off of a lot of the points that you just made. So like what you just said about talent and intelligence, for example, like in terms of IQ, this is very important, like you were just saying. IQ tests are based on measuring particular types of intelligence for people within a particular culture. So you could be like a super intelligent farmer who comes from a different culture, and then you go and take an IQ test in Western culture, and it shows that you're dumb, even if you're actually really fucking smart. And like you were saying too, I think I made a video about this recently, where I was talking in one part of it, I was talking about how you did, like we praise the idea of academics in our culture, and so we think like, oh dude, this guy's got like so many fancy pieces of paper that say he's smart, he's so fucking smart. But what I said about that was, yeah, but I bet he couldn't like rewire the electricity in his house, or like paint a house in a shed with five different kinds of paint and half a dozen different kinds of tools. Like that made me think. I think I mentioned before too, when I was making that video about my former boss who was a painter. For example, when I started going to school, to university, and I was talking about all this writing and all these papers I had to write and all this research I had to do, he would say, "Wow, I could never imagine doing that." But I noticed when working with him, and one of the things I learned from him is that he was phenomenally skilled at his job, to the point where he was extremely intelligent about his particular field. And oh, this also reminds me, when if we're talking about intelligence, I was listening to a Freakonomics podcast recently where they were talking about all this recent scientific evidence that's been replicated and shows that actually the more intelligent you are, it doesn't like no, it's not the more intelligent you are, it's the more you learn and the more immersed within a particular field you get. You don't actually get more intelligent, you get better at rationalizing your views. So you form more sophisticated rationalizations for your views when you get more knowledge about something, which made total fucking sense to me.
It's like if there's like a picture of something buried under sand, the more sand you remove, the easier it is to tell what it's a picture of. You might not need to remove all the sand to tell what it is, but it'll be easier if you do.
Exactly.
What were you talking about just before that?
Intelligence and the trades.
I was gonna say something about like I mean, like, there's a thing, because one of the things I did with working with learning through the arts is it's about like offering differentiated arts instruction, like essentially just accessing the fact that some kids learn different. You know, they're tactile learners, or they're audio learners, or they're visual learners, or whatever. And a comic that they used to illustrate that point, it was like a teacher and they're standing in like a field somewhere, and it's like, to be completely fair, everyone will be given the same test. Climb that tree, and lined up to do the test are like a monkey, an alligator, an elephant, and hilariously a fish like in a goldfish bowl on a little table. And it's like, well, clearly the goldfish is fucked and the monkey's gonna win, and the elephant doesn't even have to climb the tree, and like this sucks for the alligator, and you know, whatever. Like, it doesn't work to give the same test to things that have completely different capabilities to get there, right? I would, on your topic of like the pieces of paper and the like, that doesn't mean you're intelligent thing. The two arguments I would make, kind of like sort of contrary to that, but not necessarily totally contrary to that, is like, socially, I think part of the reason we like the piece of paper as a concept is it proves two things. One, you were willing to do a bunch of pointless, stupid stuff you didn't want to do for the sake of getting to a thing you wanted.
Yeah.
Honestly, all jokes aside, having a degree or some kind of certificate shows that to a person who might potentially to hire you to do stuff. This person will probably be willing to do job tasks that they don't really want to do. God, they made it through 4 years of university. They probably did a lot of stuff they didn't want to do, but they buckled down and did it anyways. Two, it's evidential that you're capable of learning new stuff. And that's like half of working anywhere, is just learning how working there works. You know,
Learning
you
new skill
figure
sets.
out their systems, you figure out their file sorting, whatever, or learn passwords, or blah, 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 whatever. And then the other thing is, at a certain point, I think getting a bunch of certificates and certifications, going to school, whatever, you just kind of like learn how to learn better. You
For
learn
sure.
more about your style of learning. You figure out like what helps you gather information most quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
We've been talking for like a little over 2 hours now. You want to tuck her in pretty quick here?
Sure. Sure. Yeah. That was a great conversation, bro. Thanks for talking with me again. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And yeah, and of course I hope we talk again. And yeah, I mean, I think you pointed out a few of my biases there, and I was mainly kind of pointing out biases of the people in the so-called intellectual dark web. But like I said, I still like I like probably most of what they do, and I think that they're valuable. And it was really interesting talking about comedy and the type of people that are drawn to that and why, and depression and all that kind of stuff too. And hopefully we can talk about lots of fascinating things next time. So I'll just say all the things that I like to say at the end of my videos here, and then you can give any plugs if you want to there. I didn't remember which ones they were from last time, but I can add them to the description of this video. So anyway, thanks everyone so much for watching another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I and hopefully Nick enjoyed having this conversation. And as I always say, thank you everyone so much for everyone who's subscribed to my channel and everyone who's contributed to me on Patreon. And thank you so fucking much to anyone else who's subscribed to my channel and to anyone else who contributes to me on Patreon. I really fucking appreciate it, and you have no idea how much it means to me. And I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. All right. So you got any plugs there, Nick?
Nothing substantial. I think the last time I was on here, I mentioned that my friend Jeff and I are in a band called Dope Afternoon, which we are still working towards releasing some of our first content. We should have potentially like a sort of demo EP album thing coming out soon, and maybe a music video or two. But that'll probably be in the next couple of months. If anybody has looked at that page since the last video or looks at it now, you'll notice that literally nothing has changed, really. But there should be some stuff moving on there pretty soon. Other than that, I'm Nick Heffelfinger. You can check me out on IMDb.
Want to send
Peace.
me a link for your page for your band, and I'll add it to the description of this video again there?
For sure, bro.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much for talking, bro.
You
And
bet, dude. Bye,
adios.
buddy.
And I love you.
Love you too, dude.
Adios until next time, everyone, and keep having mindgasms and mindgasming all over the place. Adios.
Peace, dude.